Can you name one big drought, flood, snow, or ice storm in the New Testament? Now, the answer is no. There was a storm on the Sea of Galilee. Now, there was a big storm on a little bit of the Mediterranean because Paul's ship foundered, right? But after that, flood, snow, ice storm. In fact, from the Roman records, we discover that 100 to 200 years after Jesus was born is an incredibly stable weather period. No ice or snow hinders anything. So don't be surprised. God actually used the Roman Empire to spread stone roads and to spread security with Roman forces right to the ends of the earth, as it were. So the missionaries already had their way prepared for them. But when you go back to the Old Testament, the first reference to ice, because you should know your Bible says, in the beginning everything was very good and Adam and Eve were stark naked. So you know they were not exposed to ice at all. But in Job chapter 6, Job says his brothers have dealt deceitfully with him as a brook that's frozen. They're black. Now, I never knew what black ice was until I went to New Zealand, and they had road warnings, beware black ice. And I thought, what is this? And it warned me about a corner that was covered with black ice. And when I went round the corner, I actually didn't. I went straight off the road. I discovered it was covered with a very thin layer of black ice. You couldn't see it on the road, and you would simply slip everywhere. The first reference to ice is in association with people who couldn't be trusted. And in Job chapter 38, Job is pondering his treatment by God, and he's complaining almost. And he wants to know what's causing this. And God basically says, well, Job, I'll ask you some questions, and if you can answer these questions, then I'll answer yours. Okay, out of whose womb came the ice and the hoary frost of heaven? Who has given birth to it? The waters are hid with as a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. Okay, now God asked Job those questions about where did the ice come from. Ice, like a baby, came quickly. Now, nobody thinks that the reference here is to someone who was pregnant and took 1,000,000 years to give birth to the ice. That doesn't make any sense of this analogy. Babies, if you've had a pregnant wife or you know someone who's given birth, you don't spend 10 years giving birth. You're dead, the baby's dead. Out of whose womb came the ice? Where did this come from? Job didn't know. And I'll be honest, we are now thousands of years later, and I've asked professor after professor, what do we know about where the ice came from? And in most cases they say, we have absolutely no idea. And then some will say, oh, but here's what could have happened. What's interesting is this is so tied up with climate change. When you read about the astronomy stuff, and this is a couple of years ago now, look what they're saying. If you're worried about the ice melting, because that's what this was the context, then heat is not just happening on the world. It's not just hot in England at the moment. The heat is building up right across the universe, in the galaxies. So whatever's happening climate-wise, whether it was the coming of the ice or whether it's the melting of the ice, it's something that's bigger than planet Earth. So what about the Ice Age? Now, Diane and I put this program together years ago, and let's have a good question, because I've had the advantage of traveling to almost the ends of the earth. And the one thing I've discovered is if you want to know how the ends of the earth got to be what they are, then you need to start with the one who made them. God looked at everything he made, and in the beginning, it was very good. The man and his wife were both naked. That's how good the weather was. They did not need protection from the cold. There was no need for umbrellas to protect from the heavy rain. There wouldn't be any heavy rain till Noah's flood. There's quite a few weather clues in the history of the Bible. Now, what we're going to be doing is taking you through a biblical history, and then we're looking at the evidence as we go. Because we make no apologies, we try our very best to give you a biblical perspective on the actual history and evidence that you do find. So undeniably, there's a history of the lifespans. Now, Diane drew this up years ago because we'd never found a similar one. You can find lists of how old people were, but there's Adam, the first man. He lived till he was 930. Noah lived till he was 950. And the sad thing is, you and I live on the wrong side of Noah. And by the time we get to Moses, excuse me, I've still got that cold, he's dead at 120. And you and I are on his wrong side. Climate change, after the flood, God told Noah, until the end of the world, there'll be seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter. Now, none of this should be new to you because we've produced 4 or 5 different video programs. Joseph is the last one to deal with the ice in Iceland, and he may come back to that. But you see, the Bible is basically saying there's no winter, there's no summer, there's no cold, and there's no heat until after the flood of Noah. No wonder things changed. It was much harder to live in a post-flood world. Abraham only lasted 175 years. The lifespan of creatures, of plants, of humans, of animals is diminished by the climate particularly. It's really hard to live out in the desert. I've been out in the desert, there's almost no food there. Easy to find rocks, but I tell you what, struggling to survive in winter as well as in summer. The real history of weather, by the time you get up to Job, you find winter is mentioned, so it's possibly going to get colder, but ice and snow and hail are not mentioned till Job. And Job is one of these anomalies in the Bible. It's very hard to place where Job lived. There's no references to Israel that can easily be proved, but we do know he lived after Noah, and we do know he lasted for 300 years. So he seemed to outlive Abraham by ages, but he didn't live as long as Shem. Now, by the time you get past Job and you get into Abraham, drought is a prevalent feature. By the time you get to Moses, there's drought, there's floods, there's winter, there's summer, there's erratic climate, and you and I live in that erratic climate zone. All right, there's one erratic climate that I've been to. I've been there in summer, I've been there in winter. In summer, it's beautifully green. In winter, brrr, look, I mean, walking in that frost, my feet froze. Look at that. One of my friends took that picture in an ice cave. Wow, fantastic. Beautiful, but beautiful enough to kill you. So no longer is the world very good when ice comes. I mean, it looks spectacular looking down that valley. Wow. In Alaska, notice even if it's covered by ice in winter, there are many times when the exposure in summer is not even enough to get more than lichens and algae growing at all. Yep, I took that picture. Isn't that pretty? That's about what you get growing. There's a few dead pine trees from all these times when the pine trees have grown well, but mostly these days you just get a tiny little bog sort of fauna. You get some animals that can survive on that all year because they can dig down through the snow. Summertime, there's enough food for them to really grow wild, and that they mate in the warm and the green. Beautiful lifespan, beautiful area, but only in summer. And in winter, unless you are adapted and you already can dig through the snow, because, I mean, look at their long legs. If you didn't have long legs, you'd never last in the snow at all. Diane's going to talk a bit about that sort of thing a bit later. And look at some of the beautiful birds that fly into the area, because in summertime, these ponds are actually rife. Oh, we're in Alaska, and of course in Alaska, as well as much of northern Canada, their national bird is the mosquito, because they grow pretty big and they're pretty fearsome. There's also interesting bears. No, that's not a polar bear because it's the wrong color. But I'm going to leave all that to Diane. But look what he's eating. He's eating that nice big fish. There's his normal diet. I know that because I've done exploration in Alaska, and you have to learn how to tell when the vicious bears, the polar bears, the grizzlies, etc. Well, look, most of them eat grass for much of the year because that's all that's there. Once a year, they'll eat salmon, so their big teeth are not for killing things. Most of the time, they eat blueberries. That's how you know where they are. Their poop is a beautiful blue. Now, I'm serious. That's when you know they're around. Or these are the guys you need to be aware of. White. Well, I remember one explorer telling me, listen, there's a big grizzly bear cross. You know, the grizzly bear that's sort of white-grey, and he's crossed with a polar bear. Watch out for him because he's nearly 4 meters tall. They are big. They are strong. And if they're hungry, you need to watch it. I'm serious about that because I saw a group of bears on the next hill, and the boss of the bear little group stood upright, and you could see him sniffing in the air. I was on the hill over, which I was very grateful for, along with my friend and along with Magnum 44s and shotguns, etc. Because what the bears did, it was just coming out of winter. We were into spring, so there was enough snow melt for us to move around, but he could smell us. And across that valley, he came and his girlfriends came, and they were after one thing, our hides. There's one where he's lost. We've got his hide in a museum. But you see, there's not too many people have been unable to get close up to a grizzly bear. Um, but benefit of one person who's been involved in National Geographic, he's got a lovely grizzly bear coat, yeah, from previous days. Can you see when you go down through the beautiful white hair? Underneath it, you find the skin is black. Now that's fascinating. I wonder whether it used to be all black, or whether it used to be brown. How did we end up with polar bears anyway? Because if they're becoming extinct, whose fault is that? Does it matter? I mean, look, you pull enough hairs off, and this was done with permission of the locals and the governments, etc. So I don't think we've done anything illegal. You'll find that he's got absolutely black skin underneath. Well, I've travelled Canada, I've travelled through Alaska, I've travelled all through England, much of Europe, and this man is the guy we're talking about his theories today. He's Louis Agassiz. He's got quite a few things named after him. He was actually a sort of a generic creationist, a Christian type scholar, and he came up with a theory as a result of all the evidence he saw, and I'll take you through. He believed there was a time when much of Canada and much of the rest of the world, particularly in the northern climes, was covered with ice. So don't be surprised people come up and say, oh, you're a Christian, you believe the Bible. Where did the ice come from? Where does it fit in? How come it's not mentioned in the Bible? Well, it is. It's mentioned in the book of Job. In fact, God asked Job the same question you're asking me. Where did it come from? Let's start in eastern Nova Scotia. Can you see the gravel at the top? Can you see the chaotic layers in the rock here? Yep. Now I've been from one side of Canada to the other. Here's a ice debris quarry that I was in. Now, ice doesn't form very neat layers because the only time the water will behave in layered formation is when it melts at the end of the glacier. So you get little layered bits, but you get lots of stuff spread across Canada. I see the stuff at the top. That's the very chaotic ice debris. Piles of rocks of all sizes and all shapes, gravel of all sizes, sand of all sizes, chaotically in beds, but enough to show you water's been there. But also, see that rock that's underneath it? The grey limestone in the quarry? That wasn't dumped by ice, that was chewed off the top by ice. How do I know it was chewed off? Well, you get onto it. Yes, we take our brooms even out into the field and we clean it off so we can actually see. On the top of the layers of the limestone are big scratches. In fact, going down into this railway cutting, you see the railway has cleaned off the edge of the cutting for us. We didn't need to polish any of that. And you can get up close and look what you find on it. There's scratches. In fact, these scratches turn out to be the results of the boulders that are being pushed along by the ice, acting as mini blades, and until they wear out and powder down, they'll create big scratches. Now, sometimes this has been very useful when it comes to minerals, because there's a famous story of one geologist who found some copper in a glacial boulder, and he decided, I'm going to follow the glacial scratches back. And he went right through the USA, northern part, and up into Canada, round the top of the Great Lakes, and sure enough, he found where the scratches finished, and that's where one of the biggest copper mines in the north was founded. You see, you can put your compass down, you can trace them. Sometimes you find the scratches have gone in several directions, so the ice has flowed several times through there. In fact, by the time you cross England into Wales, you will find that the same thing has happened on the border lands of Snowdonia and that. Here we are right up in Snowdonia, and can you see the scratches? In fact, get up closer. As you follow down the valley, many of the exposed rocks. So in Canada and in the UK and Wales, you'll find the evidence of the movement of ice. And Louis Agassiz in his original country was familiar with ice. As he traveled through Europe, he was familiar with glaciers because they were already there and they were moving slowly and they had boulders in the front and they would behave and scratch the ice present, scratch the rock present tense. So he wasn't just making up a suggestion as to what ice did, he could actually observe it. In fact, I took that picture high up in the air, and can you see the surface that's been molded down? I mean, every bit of earth and that has been removed from it, and you can follow big directional scratches in the land. Well, when you actually have a look in between the mountains, you sometimes find little glacial pools that are all that's left of where a glacier would have once started. But you can follow the glacial valleys down, and if there's any ice and snow, and in many cases, you can find the ice and snow still there. And in fact, see that there? It's picking up rocks. Those dark layers are rock layers. The ice is cracking up. Everything's moving down the valley, usually very slowly. Some glaciers actually travel pretty fast, but whether they're fast or slow, at the end of the glacier where it melts, that's the pile of debris that's left. See, there's flat boulders, there's rounded boulders, there's boulders with scratches, there's boulders with cracks, and this has been dumped. There's big boulders, there's little boulders. So glacial piles don't get sorted out like stream debris. Stream debris will take the big boulders, put them in one place, little boulders, put them in another. Glacial, you can always tell if the glacier dropped its load because it will be pretty well unsorted. Well, here's a gravel pit that I took a field trip to. I was leading the field trip because I collected here many times. Can you see there's lots of boulders? They're all sizes. And occasionally there's some nice neat layers that may go on for 50 meters or 100 meters. And that's where the water has been melting more rapidly than it did at other times. And so you get rubble heaps and you get tiny organized layers. There, see? This happens inside the glacial boulders, and the rest of it just acts as a glacial pile. Well, here we are at the other end of the countryside, and can you see way up north, you've got layers of sediment, but then it's absolutely barren on the top. There's nothing much growing there. Funny thing is, when you go up the north of Alaska, you find plenty of evidence in the north that there was never any ice sitting on it. The death of the plants has been caused by the fact that it's freezing cold, but ice didn't build up. So Louis Agassiz took all of these clues. There's some parts of Alaska, particularly the north, where there's no evidence the ice has ever been there. There's some parts of Alaska where, from the traditions of the natives, we know they came down ice-free valleys as they crossed over the area. But the southern part, because I've been to the southern part, is full of snow-rich mountains that are producing glaciers. I'd watched some of them for 30 to 40 years to see if they really are melting. All right, there's a picture of the distribution of the ice. Do you see the North Pole there? You see Greenland? Based on the evidence of the rocks, based on the evidence of the distribution of the scratches, based on the evidence in Alaska, well, there's Alaska on the middle left-hand side. Can you see it's the bottom that was covered by ice, not the top? The top always was movable. The top of Russia may be famous for having mammoth piles of bones, but even though Siberia, which is that area there, is technically one of the coldest places on the planet, the cold comes because of the ice elsewhere. It has not produced ice in Siberia. It has not produced ice in Alaska. So there's a bit of an anomaly here. Even though Louis Agassiz came up with the theory that ice had been over much of the north, he had no idea how it got there. Neither does anybody that I know of, except for God's question. Do you know where the ice was born from, Job? Now, Job understood the question. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been a fair question of God to ask, because God was seeking, what knowledge do you have, Job? If you can answer my questions, I'll answer yours. Good technique. You might notice also that the ice is not evenly spread around the North Pole. You see, I was told at school that when it got cold enough, the snowfall actually built up and ice layers formed. Well, you mightn't have been up that far, but I'll tell you what happens. It doesn't snow. The snow blows around. The colder the air gets, once the air gets below sort of 0 degrees, the air's bone dry. It's almost hilarious to go to Alaska and see the ladies can hang their clothes out to dry at -3, -4, -5 degrees, because the water is absolutely gone from the air and it actually will dry out really quickly. You can almost get a cup of water and throw it up in the air, -10 degrees, and it almost evaporates instantly. Boom! Looks like an explosion. You'll see Greenland. Funny thing, wonder why it's called green. It was covered in ice. All the evidence tells us that. In fact, the finding of the mammoths in Alaska or across Siberia, which is a fact of history, and some of them are actually preserved so well the explorers ate them. How do I know that? I got their diaries and checked. That's what they said. Oh, and some of these beautiful excavated creatures are dug out and put on display, including the mummified ones, the baby ones that were born and then couldn't survive and are found buried in the ice and the muck. Some beautiful examples, and a new one just recently with hair still on them. So the funny thing is, we know that the mammoths were not actually equipped for living in the cold, because organisms that are designed for living in cold don't just rely on hair, they rely on fatty tissue. Well, here's the big mammoth at the park I went to check on. Mastodons and mammoths are sort of similar, but a little different. When you have a look at them, it doesn't seem like they were designed to be living in a cold environment. When you look at the creatures that survived, well, they survived. Well, I'll let Diane deal why they survived. She's coming up a little later. Did you see the big hairy models? When they first existed, the snow would not have been there at all. So did they survive because their body was big enough? Because they had a trunk that could reach through the snow? Because there's no food there for that creature to survive anyway. You find some of these big musk oxes, and they can survive because they actually chew on the lichen and the algae, and they actually have a pretty clever idea for keeping warm. They'll form these big circles and they'll insulate the ones that are in the middle. And then you watch them, and then they'll actually change places. Now, did they think of that? That's not a survival technique they would have needed before the ice came. Oh, in this cave here, yes, I like taking people to caves like this. Joe, I think you've been to one of these caves in England that I told you about, because this is one of the ice caves, Ice Age caves, famous because inside were full of bones.
I've been down that very one.
Yeah, that's right. Full of bones, and simply because of the type of bones. You go there today and you've really got to search hard. There's some interesting oil deposits and bitumen deposits around there coming out of the limestone, but that's a different subject. But occasionally you'll find bones. But what's interesting, the bones that are in these caves, there they are, musk oxus, hairy rhinoceroses, and hippopotamus. Hippopotamus? Yeah, hippopotamus. Where do hippopotamus live? That's right, in hot countries, in Africa. And yet, when these caves were the last refuge places where hippopotamuses in England lived, it was because they were sheltering from the cold that was coming, and they didn't make it. You see, hippopotamuses had no hair, they had no fatty insulation. They had either two options: one, to evolve fat and protection, or two, to leave. Well, I guess the third option is die out. They died out. Some of them left England and they've never come back except in zoos. Well, the question, are the glaciers melting? Well, yeah, I took that picture. Can you see the glacier at the end? If you look right up the middle right of the picture, you'll see the glacier is still there. Now, I've been to this glacier many times over many decades, and the last time there was no glacier. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, well, you can still see the glacier high up in the valley, but it was kilometres down when I first went there. I've been watching glaciers in Washington State as well, and there's no doubt about it. Many of the glaciers on that side of the coast have been melting. Some of them have been advancing, but most of them have been melting. Well, the last time I took the picture, you could hardly see the glacier at all. You had to go further up, round the corner, and poke your camera in just the right place. And there it is, stuck up between those two hills on the way to disappearing. Now, this one, why do I include him? Because originally, you see this green tree in the front? That's where the glacier was. And look, it's retreated in living memory. These have been melting beyond a shadow of a doubt. And the funniest thing is, it didn't take 1,000,000 years for the environment to recover. Basically, what you find is these trees would march up almost at the same, I don't mean march as in walk, I mean the progress of the forest. It would start with a mature forest way down the valley, then the seeds and that would grow as fast as the glacier moved back, the forest would follow it. It did not take millions of years of regrowth. I say that because people say, oh, if all the ice melts, the forest is ruined. No, the environment seems to regenerate. There seems to be rules built into the world that the greenies don't appreciate or don't estimate that God has outthought us in most of these areas. You see, there's the ice. See that face up there? Again, one of my friends took this picture when he wrote an article for National Geographic on the ice. You see the little fluffy flowers that are no more than 50 meters behind the ice? And as it goes backwards, these little flowers follow. They open up the soil. Behind them come the small shrubs and the grasses. Behind them come the little trees, then the bigger trees. And it doesn't take 1,000,000 years to regrow. It's not too long before that's less than 1 kilometre away from where the ice is. Marshes, boggy trees, etc. And you would come along and you'd say, oh, mature growth swamp. No, it wasn't there 100 years ago. By the time you get down to the coast, you will find that the forest has regrown totally. You say, what? How did you get to the coast? Well, I didn't, but Captain Cook did. I mean, I've been there since then. But you see, when Captain Cook actually went to this area, he reported the glaciers were 1 mile thick. Wrote all about it, read his diary. Now, that's in the late 1700s. So from the late 1700s right up to the present, these glaciers have been melting back, and you would swear on a stack of Bibles in a court of law that is a mature growth forest. But it's no older than a couple of 100 years at the most. You know, we saw the same thing in Australia because my dad used to be in mining, and he was up in the tin mining areas of North Queensland, and we had a big political battle up there because they wanted to build a road up through the Daintree to North Queensland, and all of the greenies, bless their hearts, said, don't do it, you'll destroy the old growth forest. Now, the court case went on until the Premier, who was pro-road and pro-development, actually brought up a couple of photos. What were the photos? The area when it was undermining, and basically every tree had been removed. 100 years later, it was a mature old growth forest, except it wasn't old at all. It had regenerated since the mining fields had been abandoned. Oh yes, there are people up in these areas now. And again, a reminder that the north of Alaska is not icy snow covered. The south of Alaska is. Having met with some of these Inuit people and gone onto their lands with their permission to look for dinosaur bones, etc., you learn some interesting things. Like they have religious concepts. They have an organized religion. They have almost idolatry type religions, except not quite. These are ancestral sort of things, but they do actually remember a time when they weren't there. And if you look at this is up in the local museum, so don't tell them I'm making it up. You'll find they have stories of where they come from. Now, that's what I find interesting about North America, because I've talked to the Dakota Sioux, I've talked to the Apache, etc. I've talked to the Eskimos. Yes, I call them Eskimos. I know that's politically incorrect, but let's be blunt. That's what they call themselves. It may be the white people who think that's politically incorrect, but I'm happy to use what they call themselves. This is the Chugach area, and they talk about coming from up there down to the channel all the way through the ice where it was clear and on from there. The Dakota Sioux talk about coming the other way. Why do I mention that? Because most European anthropologists say all the Indians came from the northwest over the Bering Sea, and they went south, and you just insulted the Dakota Sioux because they say we came from the land beyond the sunrise after the big flood. Yep, they actually do. But going back to the Chugach people, that's what you can reconstruct. They've come across the area from Siberia, and their looks and their language match the story. They've actually walked across the Bering Sea. Well, it wasn't a sea there, but it's actually a very shallow strait, and you can get through there. You have to be very careful. It's a very good protective area for the Americans to guard because it was easy to catch Russian submarines going through there. It's such a shallow place. It's like the British Channel, really. Shallow, drop the water 50, 100, 200 meters, and you can cross it with no trouble whatsoever. And in fact, you have to ask, in these days of threats about sea level changes, is this anything new? Doesn't seem to be. You see, on today's maps, you can go and look and bring up, because of the concern about sea level change, what would happen if the water dropped 10 meters, 20 meters, 50 meters? You get dire predictions, all the natives in the Pacific will drown or they'll dry out, etc. But it's easy to do the computing because it's done for you. You see the light blue section? You can walk from Siberia to Alaska simply by dropping the water 100 meters. 120, you can walk clean around the planet, basically. Yep, you didn't take a million years. You don't need to invent brand new boats. You can just do it by walking. There's a question I get asked. What if all the ice melts today? Problem. Now, I've seen ice melting. I've watched the glaciers retreating. I've seen it happen in quite a few places. It's not an issue we have much in Australia. There's not too much evidence of too many main glaciers on the mainland of Australia. But when you look at the ice that used to be, based on the evidence of the glacial piles, the movement of the scratches, etc., can you see how much of the north was covered by ice? Well, if you want to go, oh, by the way, Joseph, did you see the Hubbard Glacier there? Your family's been involved in this. 95% of the ice has already melted. It's interesting. You see, people are concerned about the melting ice now because of polar bears and penguins that Diane's going to deal with, but 95% of the ice is already gone. And the world hasn't been covered by water as a result. The sea levels really haven't changed a huge amount to destroy the planet. Well, there it is there. You know, these satellite images are fantastic. 95% of the ice has already gone. Well, there's some of the ice that still remains. You see, it's in southern Alaska, the northern part. So again, I want to stress that if you think the ice comes because of the cold, that's simply not true. Where the ice is, it will be cold, but where the cold is, there's not necessarily ice at all. Why the difference? You know, I talked to one of the geographers, and he basically said, we've tried every sort of theory, but we really can't come up with any answer at all. So to God's question to Job, Job didn't know the answer. And if we're brutally blunt, there's tens of theories. And so far, we know the effect of the ice on the people. We know where they could move. We know how they took the stories. But you know what's interesting? Not one of their stories includes, when we came here, we saw the ice come. Oh, we find out that when they came there, the ice was already there. So none of the folk traditions in the Middle East or in the far north or in the south or in Australia are any help at all. And the Bible asks the question. It doesn't give the answer. Well, God said to Noah, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. We were prophesied by God to Noah that winter would come. I'm sure Noah didn't understand the significance of that because he'd never seen winter. And Job told his friends, heat and drought remove melting snow. They certainly do. You have heat, the ice will melt. You have drought, there's no actually ice that can be precipitated. I'm serious. You see, when you go to the north, it is not the cold that makes the ice. If you have no moisture in the air, you can't actually get any ice whatsoever. So Antarctica, as well as the north of Canada, are some of the driest places on the planet. Try going out in the ice and snow with your skin not even covered by, nice Vaseline or some sort of oil. You will dry out. Job states that his friends are like streams. We mentioned this before, darkened with thawing ice. So we know that Job understood the question about ice because he tells us he experienced it. He knew about thawing. He knew that summer would ruin the ice. He knew that the heat would melt it, melt the ice, melting the snow. So in Job's day, and we know he was somewhere in the Middle East, ice and snow had already reached the Middle East, but that doesn't tell you where it came from. You can follow the scratches like that famous geologist did, find a bit of copper, follow it back, and earn yourself a fortune. Even Job's critic, Elihu, describes God as the one who tells the snow and rain to pour down on the earth. Hey, does that get into your thinking? Is God the author of rain? Well, the Bible's emphatic, he is. God told Noah that it will begin to rain, one of the most accurate weather forecasts there's ever been. And then there'd be summer, then there'd be winter. And that's an accurate description of God. He's the one who tells the snow and the rain. God asked Job, have you been to the places where the snow and hail are stored? Now, probably couldn't have answered that question. Perhaps he had. He'd been up into the hills around where he lived and saw the snow that never went away. Well, snow that's stored becomes glacial. God asked Job, who gave birth to all this? Job had no answer. Interesting. But you see, Job lived after Noah. Job lived after Shem. Job lived around about the time of Abraham, a little bit before, etc. But reality by his day, ice, snow, and hail. Hail, damaging hail. Hail becomes a weapon that God will use even to destroy the whole economy of Egypt a little later on. I've certainly lived through hailstorms. I've seen the terrible damage. We had a big one last year with hail like sort of cricket balls, tough, hand size. You'd put a big hole in your roof that way. Well, here we are back almost where we started. In fact, in the bottom of that valley, we drove up a glacier. Scary, particularly when our driver sort of almost stopped. He pricked his ear up and we all heard crack. The ice had just broken. And he said, we've got to get out of here real quick because otherwise we'd be stuck as we went down through the ice, almost impossible to actually rescue. The ice and glaciers can be awfully trapping. Oh, here's an old earthquake result. Big earthquakes in Alaska. This whole forest here was dropped in sea level, and then the sea poured in, covered the pine forest with salt water, and then retreated. Well, it hasn't actually regrown. The salt water plus the cold plus the ice and the bog is a fatal recipe for actually trying to keep a forest alive. But it went up and it came down. So when you're talking about sea level, you can produce it two ways. Lift up the land, sink the land. Lift up the water, sink the water. Oh, you see, you've got lots of ways to change sea level that are not just because people are using too much salt or too little water or more CO2 or anything like that. It's got a sort of a fatal beauty to it because you can die in that cold. They build cities in Alaska, cost them a lot because the amount of energy they have to use. You need mines that are producing a lot more stuff per ton than down here to keep cities like that alive. Beautiful. Well, let's finish on what you might consider to be a controversial bit because there's Alaska today, post-Job, post-flood, post-Adam. In the beginning, Adam would have had no trouble with any cold because there wasn't any. God made the world. The only terms used in Genesis are cool because Adam walked with God in the cool of the day. So it was cool, it was warm. By the time of Noah, it was hot or it was cold. It was wet or it was dry. Back in Adam's day, a mist watered the earth every day. You didn't need your raincoat. By the days of Job, you could freeze to death. You could be bombarded to death. Can you see the history of weather has really been the same as all the other we've been doing? Good to bad to worse to now. In fact, it seems to be a degeneration. In fact, in the last days that the Bible talks about, have you ever pondered what the weather's going to do? Because if you were making a prediction based on that graph, even the weather is going to go further downhill. Well, here's my couple of interesting finish slides before Joe might want to take over, do a question time, or allow Craig to do a little bit on Tasmania. All right, so we have here, do you see the beautiful Aurora Borealis? Aurora Australis is the one down in the southern hemisphere, but these are fabulous electronic displays. caused by, the particles that come in from outer space and strike up this atmosphere. Beautiful stuff. But one other thing that is usually missed, we live in a day where Russia is regarded as a terrorist state. Russia is regarded as anti-Christian, has been for a long time. It may have a strong state church, but there was a day when the only people who came to Russia with the gospel, or came to Alaska with the gospel, were the Russians. Right? Keep that in perspective. And there's the evidence. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So I think at this time we need to pray for Russia, that the gospel might actually be expanded over there as elsewhere.